Okay, let's try this again. Welcome to Forking Off, the podcast for people who said no to just following orders, where we explore the very personal decisions behind leaving federal service, whether by choice or by force. Every departure has a story, and we're here to share them.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Forking Off. I'm Jill Fields,
And I'm Philip Fields.
and today we have with us Dr. John Cordle, U.S. Navy retired. Hi, John. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me.
John, why don't you go ahead and get us started with your bluff, your bottom line up front?
Well, my bottom line up front, I'm a career naval officer. Went to the Naval Academy, spent 30 years in the Navy, retired as a captain, had a couple of command tours, retired in 2013, went off and did some contracting work, and then came back to government service in 2020, right at the height of COVID, and began a job as a human factors engineer at the commander of Naval Surface Force Atlantic. So loved what I was doing, loved the interaction with sailors. Had always planned to do 5 years or so and then reevaluate. But then when this year came around, it changed enough that I decided to take another path. Didn't take the DRP, but decided to retire from government service. Just feeling like the things that I was working on, the things that I believed in were no longer aligned with the folks who were running the organization. Just didn't feel welcome there anymore. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah. Thank you. And you've had quite the career, 30 years in the Navy, plus coming back for another 5 years. Why don't you tell us about how you got started in public service?
Okay. The first time around when I was 18, it was pretty easy. I was in high school. My dad was a retired Navy officer, former enlisted, and he basically said, son, I'm not paying for college. You're not living at home. Here's some applications to the Naval Academy, which is free, and good luck. And so I applied to the Naval Academy and Georgia Tech, ROTC, never having been to either school, didn't even know there was a Naval Academy, but it was paid for. I did the interviews, I got in, and anything to get out of Georgia. So it was more, I wouldn't necessarily call it a calling. It was more, I was kind of pushed out the door, and there was a landing pad. But the Navy was all I knew growing up. My dad was in when I was growing up. He was in Vietnam, and so service was kind of part of our family fabric. All my aunts and uncles went to the Navy, loved it. My sister said I was just too lazy to look for another job for 30 years, and they kept telling you where to go and what to do. So I had 2 command tours on a destroyer and a cruiser, did multiple deployments, was fortunate enough to win some leadership awards or to be recognized for some of my leadership accomplishments. Towards the end of that, I got focused on, why am I so tired all the time, right? I'm sure with your FBI service and with the military, we sometimes take sleep deprivation as something that you take for granted as part of the job. And I
wouldn't know anything about that.
and yet, it's kind of funny. I say that the people who you can least afford to have sleep deprived are the ones who are always sleep deprived, like the police, the first responders, the doctors, the military, FBI. I started to learn some more about sleep and about how your body responds. Worked with entities like the Naval Postgraduate School, the Naval Health Research Center, and found some studies that were showing there are things you can do to adjust your sleep patterns to be more alert all the time. And so I began to work towards the implementation of some policy changes in the Navy, despite the fact that I wasn't in charge of any of the policies. But by bringing facts to the table and research and showing it, demonstrating it on deployment, I was able to work through and get the Navy to sort of change the way they looked at sleep. So I'm pretty proud of that. And then when I went off into retirement, I got a job teaching back to the Navy in maintenance, which is totally unrelated to that. But I spent a lot of my free time working in that to support research projects and just talking about it and advocating. In 2017, there was a collision, 2 collisions that took the lives of 17 sailors. And fatigue was a huge factor in those collisions. And they created a job for someone to basically focus on that for the Navy. I was just finishing up my doctorate at ODU. And, as my wife said, why don't you get paid for doing this? Because you're doing it, you come home from work and you do 2 hours of other stuff. I applied in September, interviewed in October, got an offer in January of 2020, and then was onboarded in May. So that was sort of my return. But it was, so many people sent me this job application on LinkedIn, the other sources, saying, John, it's like they built this for you. And it really was kind of exactly what I had been working on in my free time for years. And it was a chance to make a difference. But I saw that opportunity and I jumped at it and really never looked back. It was really a fantastic opportunity. It's rare that you find a job that actually fits what you'd rather be doing all the time anyway. And I think I had found that in my human factors job.
Yeah, you mentioned the importance of sleep, And like, I just want to echo that. It's a story that I don't think I told you when we talked before. Is back when I was enlisted in the Marine Corps on my first deployment, we were doing a lot of like, we were running 18-hour patrols. You know, we were out like all evening, all night, coming back in the next day. And we had been out for 18 plus hours, and I'm walking in front of the truck up to get a refuel before we go to sleep for the day. And my driver, he's pretty wiped out and tired. Yeah, he ran right up over the back of my leg.
Oh no!
With the Humvee, you know, about 16,000 pounds, and I took off running as fast as I could, trying to get away. I didn't know what was going on except that there was pain. Yeah. So thankfully, it wasn't terrible. It did contribute to my VA rating, but I was only down for a few days. So yes, I echo immensely the value of sleep and its impact on military operations.
That's a great story. Not a good way to get your disability rating bumped up.
No.
So, John, you were doing really great work with studying fatigue and how that hits everything. You were doing something that you loved. Why did you leave?
Well, I think with all decisions in life, you have two sides to every coin. And on one side was what you just described. And in my case, on the other side, were really two things. One was my family. My wife and I have been married for 30 plus years. As a military spouse, sometimes you're a little bit, as she would say it, sometimes in the backseat from a career standpoint.
Yes.
And she was starting to remind me of that and remind me that, hey, this is a 40-hour-a-week job, not a 40-hour plus bring the computer home, plus answer emails on the weekends, plus, sit at the, table typing on your iPhone to draft an email for Monday morning. A couple things were happening this year already for me. One, I was hitting 62, which is old enough to get Social Security. Number two, I hit 5 years, which was enough to draw a small pension. One of my friends, I didn't know this, but he showed me the way to buy back my Naval Academy time. So essentially, I had the opportunity to hit 5 years and then basically retire as if I had 10 or nine plus. Not a huge paycheck. That's definitely shopping money, and so it was another income stream. So I already had that in the back of my mind. Starting now, I can pretty much choose when I want to retire. The other thing I didn't mention, I probably should, is where my private life and my public service sort of collided was back in 2020. You might remember, I'm sure you remember, Black Lives Matter and all of the changes that went on in our society. I met a friend named Keith Green who wrote a book called Black Officer, White Navy, which I highly recommend. Keith really sort of schooled me in what I had missed during my military career, as far as, we used to joke that, he had to kick down doors both as a junior person coming in, enlisted, and then one of the first Black officers in the Navy. I mean, literally showing them on a ship, and they went to security alert because they thought that you had to be a fake because there were no Black naval officers. And me coming from a white military family, middle class, where it was, which open door are you going to march through? And so we started looking at things like beards in the military and how they discriminate, how the policies discriminate against minorities, things like miscarriage policy, things like the naming of an aircraft carrier for a segregationist, things that minorities, women just deal with every day coming to work, but they shouldn't have to. So I sort of became branded as a DEI advocate, to the point where I was writing articles. I was published in Navy Times and the Proceedings magazine, giving speeches at large conventions. Well, come in January, the first thing that came out after the administration came into power was all DEI billets are cut. If you know of someone who's doing DEI work, you have to report that so that we can fire them. So there was a bit of fear that that the work that I had done, which I so passionately believed in, was now going to be used against me, even though it wasn't in my PD, not in my work title, but it was out there. And so I sort of had this background of just fear starting as early as like the first couple of weeks in January. And that began to nag at me and start to affect my sleep and my sort of mental health. So that was the first layer of sort of, hey, this is different, right? That was sort of a wake-up call. And started to have those conversations with my wife that, hey, maybe you should get out before they come after you, which is an odd way to feel for the organization that you dedicated your life to.
Yeah.
But that's the way I was feeling in January.
Talking about the DEI, I know you and Keith Greek, you went and you spoke to different places. You had mentioned to me when they did the scrubs of the websites and the postings of DEI and pulling everything, there are stories of the two of you speaking that are now wiped
Yeah, the stuff that we wrote is still out there because it was in, civilian publications. But a couple of examples we used to do what they called a DEI symposium once a year. It was a leadership symposium sort of focused on, diversity, inclusion, but really leadership topics. Because at the end of the day, there's this narrative that DEI is about giving other people unfair advantage. It was really about removing the unfair disadvantages in the system. And that's what we talked about. So we were speaking, in the front row was the commanders, the flag officers, chief of naval operations, really important people, Secretary of the Navy, and we were given these lectures, and then they would write them up on what's called VVids, is the defense video site, essentially an official news release that would come out with either a video or a short clip from the talk, or a headline discussion of Cordle and Green talk about this. And so there were 3 or 4 of those out there, and it was kind of strange. I met someone through LinkedIn. His daughter's a graduate student, and she said, "I'll scrub the internet, look for all the stuff that you've written, all the stuff that references you, and put it all in one catalog for you." But she contacted me and said, "Hey, I see links up here, but when I click on the link, there's a 404 error." And so essentially any mention of Keith and my work on a Navy website was basically erased. We spoke at the Naval History and Heritage Command up in Washington, D.C. There was a good article about that. There was an article about the diversity. So it was kind of lost to history, which is kind of painful.
It's sad that all of that's being wiped out. I know in the FBI, we had people that had been working in our diversity office that had been moved before January to new
Right.
positions, and they were still pulled and put on administrative leave because they had done work with DEI.
Yep, and that's the pressure that I was feeling. And frankly, several of my friends who I work closely with, who were GSs, because at the time there were positions there, were cut loose pretty summarily in that first couple of weeks with no notice or sort of justification. So that hurt too, to see your friends that you worked with. And,
Yes.
so then February comes around, Valentine's Day weekend. I'm off on a weekend getaway with my wife, and there's a collision overseas. The USS Harry Truman collided with a tanker, and when they do that, there's an investigative board that gets put together, and you go do the investigation. So I think on that Saturday morning, I got the call from my chief of staff that said, "Hey, what are you doing this weekend?" I said, "Well, I'm up here at this." He's like, "Well, what you're actually doing is flying to Greece to get on a plane and do this investigation." So we came home, packed everything up. I flew to Greece February 15th or 16th, and we started the investigation. Well, while I was over there, I was cut off from being able to respond or look at emails that were coming into my Navy.mil account. Well, through social media, I saw the Elon Musk show where he had the chainsaw, and then this email went out to everybody on Friday, that basically all government workers, that said, either respond to this email by Monday or you'll be terminated. There was total confusion in the chain of command as to do we answer this, do we not answer this, do we do this, do that. So here I am, in Sudave, Crete, texting back to my friends, my wife, my boss. What do I do? And getting conflicting guidance, and I couldn't sign into my account to answer anyway. So I kind of just said, all right, you know what? I'm going to focus on the mission, shut everything down, and I'll sort it out when I get home. But again, for 48 hours, I was just, my wife, my I were just kind of a mess. And I was the only civilian on the team. So the military folks are like, "You'll be okay." And I'm like, "Well, okay, but it doesn't feel like it." So
Never feels like it.
No. And so, again, another layer gets added to my discontent and stress and sleeplessness while I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing to try to get to the root cause of this collision so it doesn't happen again. So that was sort of the February month for me. At this point, my timeline was such that May 31st was my first available date to retire. And then the DRP came out. One of my friends, I watched him, he took it, he put in for it on a Wednesday, came in Friday, and there was somebody at his desk that said, "Okay, give us your badge, give us your computer," and they walked him out the door. And he'd only been there like 2 months. He was still probationary.
That was fast.
Oh, yeah. It was boom, boom, boom. But I saw that happening, talked to my wife and talked to my boss, and I don't think you can trust this process enough to take that. There's a scenario where you take the DRP, you don't retire the normal way, and then they kick you out, and now you got nothing. The other piece of it was we were told, although there was no official announcement, that if you take the DRP, your position is eliminated as part of the package. And I said, well, this position was put in place by a previous investigation as a corrective action, and I don't want to be complicit in eliminating the job that I'm in so that they can't fill it with somebody else. So at the end of the day, I decided not to do DRP 1.0. And then right around, so now we're into March, that's when they fired Lisa Franchetti, the chief of naval operations, in my opinion, for the sin of being female. And it was just a trend that we were seeing. But I had watched her career. I had worked with her in the past and had a great respect for her. It was just a series of, well, they won't do that. Well, they won't do that. Whatever that was, they did. They eliminated, celebrations on the ship for diversity months, like Black History Month. They eliminated some of the celebrations, the affinity groups like the National Naval Officers Association, ANZO, and made it an offense to participate in uniform or answer emails. People were afraid to open an email from an organization that was banned because they could be disciplined for it. And again, this sort of thing of, well, if you see somebody doing that, you're supposed to turn them in. And, it's funny, my wife's German, so she would talk about, yeah, we've been through this before. We call it the Stasi back in East Germany. This feels like East Germany. You're telling your friends or you're in trouble. And that's essentially what we were being told. If you don't tell and we found out that you knew, then you're going to be terminated. And so at that point, I put in my papers. It was 90 days out, but that was the last straw. I was watching her get removed for no reason.
We saw very similar things happening within the
Sure.
FBI with our highest level, our EADs, our executive assistant directors. That first week,
Wow.
they were all kicked out. I mean, they ended up taking retirement instead of
Sure.
taking a firing. Then we saw for months afterwards, it would be, okay, 6 special agents in charge of different field offices and different programs, including our intelligence program. There was no rhyme or reason for
Right.
these individuals to have been removed. And the only commonality was the minority view of that.
Right.
Especially as a female within the organization on a leadership track, it was very scary to see something like that happening.
Right. Plus, you lose that
So-
level of mentorship and sponsorship, advocacy.
Absolutely.
At all levels. But
Yeah.
two other things that sort of piled on were the RTO, the return to office mandate, which came out in I think, March, April, very short notice. The way that affected me was twofold. A lot of my work was in research and working with scientists, and a lot of scientists in the military are either contractors or GSs that work remotely. Well, we lost probably a third of our research team to the RTO, where they give them 2 weeks to move from Colorado to Monterey, California. My friend's his spouse and his wife had a job, his kids are in school, and he was expected to either quit or pack up and leave. And so Monterey Postgraduate School, where a lot of this research lives, they pretty much lost their entire team of human factors engineers. I think 5 or 6 people to either layoffs, RIFs, or the return to office cuts. Parallel with that, the National Institute of Health had a lot of grants that were going towards sleep research in the military. Those were all cut, and those grants paid for the researchers, so their jobs disappeared, the contractors. And so it really took a big hit. We managed to pull off, can't see my finger here, but Aura Rings, our measurement. It was a project we've been working on for years. And we got that onto a strike group, like right before I retired. Like literally the last thing I did was go aboard a ship and put 1,600 rings on the sailors before they deployed. So there was some satisfaction in that, but the fact that it was kind of just a last minute, what's going to be left? And then, of course, the 5 bullet emails that were,
Yes.
just insulting and designed to just instill. The first ones that came out were, answer this by Monday or you're terminated. One of my other friends, he just used AI and ChatGPT to write his once a week. He's like, it's just some AI machine reading it, so why not just have it generated? But we were counseled, don't be funny, don't be cute, don't repeat the same stuff from last week. And but the thing is, it's really a creative writing exercise, because a lot of my projects were year-long projects. Weekly progress was actually not that much. And then my boss wanted to see it before I sent it. I know a lot of people that were outside the government really kind of picked on us for being upset about that, but it was just insulting. It all kind of added up and came to a head back in like March or April.
Yeah, and something that a lot of people probably don't realize is in the FBI, we already do that every week. Every week, everybody sends up, the highlights of what they've been working on that week. These things filter all the way up from like the individual working out in the field to the executives back in DC. But very little that would ever go into those things would be something that we would send on an unclassified network to somebody outside of the agency. And so we would never be like, oh, yeah, here you go. Some random guy at OPM who was, a hacker on the dark web 6 months ago. Yeah, we'll send you our notes. That was just unheard of for us. And actually, when that email came out, it was funny because Jill and I had actually decided, this is all a little stressful. Let's get out of town for the weekend and go up to Santa Barbara. And that email came in, and we both ended up sitting on the phone and conference calls for hours on our little weekend getaway while we figured out what we were going to do.
Right.
Yeah, it was not very relaxing, and we ended up actually driving back home because like the weekend was shot at
Right.
that point.
Right. No, and you're the same way. I mean, fortunately, my boss, I had a lot of sick leave, and my boss said, well, mental health is important. So if you need time off to do these things, put in for sick leave. So I ended up kind of towards the end taking about 1 day a week of sick leave just to kind of relax, reset. That was sort of my trajectory. Did a small farewell. That was kind of the other thing with the DRP going on. Nobody knew what was going on or who was doing what. And then it was kind of funny. The first group that put in for DRP from our office, when they sent their acceptance in, they CC'd their boss, right, as a courtesy. Well, their bosses got enrolled in DRP. So instead of having 10 people enrolled, now we had 20, and 10 didn't intend to enroll. They just got caught up in it. So they had to undo that.
Oh
And
no.
then, so I ended up finishing up, I think about May 15th was my last work day. Finished up this study and got it moving. So that's ongoing. But again, the data analysts who would be working on that, a lot of them have been fired. The general, the other people that they lost out were the Navy had stood up a group of suicide prevention experts based on the rash of suicides back on the George Washington 2 years ago. And that report, well, those were all probationary employees, so they all got let go. And so I
Oh
was
no.
watching the foundation that I had built up of network and support for sailors just be dismantled. And then I kind of knew, even though I didn't take the DRP, that my job was not going to be eliminated automatically. Towards the end, the word came out that, hey, we've been told if we want to hire anybody, though, we have to cut 4 billets. One of the last things I saw was the command had about 20 people who were in some level of retirement. That either the billet was vacant or they were on DRP or like me retiring. The mid-level managers were required to rank those billets and decide which ones to fill and which ones to not fill. And someone showed me the list by mistake. And my billet, I think, was number 17 of 20. My job was to go into other people's worlds and disrupt them, right? Like, hey, your manning is causing the fatigue. You're overtasking the ships to expect this and that. My manager called me in one of my midterm counseling and said, John, you're an irritant. Like, you're bothering everybody. And I said, well, I think that's my job, right? People died because we didn't have someone doing this. And so I'm doing this, and it's going to upset people because it's change. So at the end of the day, I didn't fare very well on the refill list, and the West Coast was already gapped. So essentially, that's part of the damage here is this billet that was actually put in place as a corrective action because people died is now vacant. And the standard Navy answer is, well, somebody else will pick up that stuff. But what I found was when I took my 21 projects that I was working on to other peers, one of two things happened. They said, hey, I don't have the background or skill set to do this. I don't have the time to do this. I made a nice list, but I have no confidence that those things are getting done. I've tried to be kind of vocal about that and say, hey, we learned a lesson, we implemented change, we've undone the change. Let's not be shocked when we have a major incident that's based on fatigue after eliminating the folks who are looking at fatigue management from the Navy. That's kind of the drumbeat. If I had one message to kind of take away from this discussion, and that's just one example. What are we doing away with that can't be easily replaced because it's experience? I told somebody the other day, a young GS reached out and asked for some advice because he's like, can you put this in a framework for me? Because I'm 32. I've never seen anything like this, And I said, I can't. I've gone through like 6 or 7 administration changes. Never seen anything like this. The closest I could kind of come up with was reading about McCarthyism back in the day. I really value the folks who did stay because they have families, they have kids, they can't afford like I could to just walk away. It's tough on them now. And every time I talk to someone, they're stressed out just like I was back then. You cut out the people that were new blood coming in, the ones who really were enthusiastic, and you cut out the experienced folks who would have helped them come up to speed. And it'll take a year or two for those losses to become visible, but they will. And I just don't know, what's the backup plan? How do you recover from that? And that's the kind of the scary thing to me going forward. I hear a lot of people talking about the government's bloated and inefficient. And yes, it's inefficient, absolutely. But what is the right number of FBI or the right number of sleep scientists or of FEMA people? It's not like there's been any sort of rigor put to that process. And so as we just sort of, took a chainsaw to the federal government, some of that stuff takes a long time to come home to roost. Hopefully people will start to realize that, hey, maybe these decisions cost me something, right? They hurt me over time.
Yeah, it's funny. You You mentioned what is the right number of FBI. One of the findings after 9/11 was, the restructuring of the FBI and the beefing up of the intelligence program. And Congress actually decided then how many intelligence analysts the FBI was going to have. That's what Jill and I did. But they had not received, the Bureau hadn't received an increase in staffing for those positions since that happened back right after 9/11. So to say that we've continuously added and need to downsize is just kind of like your situation. This was in response to a major failure. This decision was made. This wasn't taken lightly.
Right. So yeah, I think there will be consequences, but again, they can be spun also to the narrative that's out there. So it's going to be an interesting ride for the next 3 years, and then my wife and I've already talked about it. She's German, and I think we're going to fly to Germany in January of the next election cycle, just to not have to. Who knows what's going to happen if the election goes? And it's kind of scary. But yeah, that was kind of my story of what I decided to do. Like I said, it wasn't all about this, but this was an additional layer and layer and layer again of, okay, now's the time to go. So here I am 3 months later. I'm sleeping better. I'm working out twice a day. I'm put some feelers out there for some consulting work, but it takes time. And of course, everybody and their brother is out there looking for jobs. My only regret is, talking to the folks back in the office of things that were important to me that are not making any progress now, because I was sort of supplying the energy to the process as a shop of one, really. That was a very unitary job in the military, in the Navy, and so that part's frustrating. But as my wife says, you can't change that, and so you can't dwell on it either. It was the right decision for me, and I just, what I'm doing now is offering what support I can for those. I started a Substack to kind of talk about mainly how I feel about some of these decisions. The reassignment of the Naval Academy superintendent. Again, another, we have almost no female officer leadership in the upper echelons of the Navy now, and that's going to have repercussions for years. I've talked to minority officers and junior officers and women officers who are afraid to gather around the water cooler or go to a meeting. And so there's a lot of fear out there, which I think was the intended purpose. It's very disconcerting to watch what's going on. Like I said in my article, I feel like my moral compass, which had guided me for 45 years, I could no longer adjust it to align with and to see folks that I felt like were not aligned with the honor, courage, commitment, core values that I grew up with. It was too much. And so here we are. But thank you for what you're doing. I think, getting folks to tell these stories, I think, is important. I think we have this sort of us and them, government employees are the villains or the bad folks. I think a lot of folks don't realize how many people are still in government service that are feeling the stress of this, but they still get the job done. And they're picking up the load for folks that left because they're not being replaced. I think it's important to kind of document what happened so somebody can look back at it 3 years from now and say, oh, that's right. That was the consequence of how people voted.
Yeah, absolutely. I get phone calls and texts every week of the stress because everything is completely unprecedented. The changes that are being made, the changes in mission, the changes in everything, like our daily work completely changed. Like how you are able to measure success changed. I mean, I'm very glad that I stepped away because I could not continue on, but I worry for the people that are still there because people don't seem to realize just how big of a change was taking place within the government and behind the scenes. I wish that I had taken a notebook and just every day wrote the one crazy or new or completely mind-boggling thing that happened that day, because I think to be able to look back on that and see what we thought was so huge January 21st compared to June 1st was nothing. Like just the change, because everything, you got so desensitized to the changes. I worry about the position that you left because you were doing such great work, and it was to help prevent future disasters and prevent future deaths. You were doing, amazing work to protect these sailors and to protect our Navy. And I'm so thankful that you did the work that you've done. you accomplished a lot, especially getting the Aura rings on there. I know with how getting any type of technology, any type
Oh,
of
yes.
new,
Oh,
that
right.
is,
Security concerns and
yes,
personal,
yes.
PII and all the stuff you have to work through there. It was a 4-year endeavor. And
Oh,
I wasn't the
wow.
lead. I had other folks who were still out there who I was supporting. But at the end of the day, 2 strike groups went out with the rings on, and gathering that data now will feed future decisions. The challenge is, and I am proud of what I accomplished, but there's other people out there that could pick that up and run with it, right? That are
Yeah.
qualified and have the experience, but we can't hire them now. It's easy to get lost in the noise, but as I pointed out, not if, when there's another collision, somebody's going to ask, hey, what about the corrective actions that we put in place last time? And I have been vocal and will continue to be vocal about the fact that those corrective actions were unraveled by the decisions made during this period. And that's going to have consequences. And that's unfortunate. But I'd rather sound that alarm now
Yes.
than wave the I told you so flag. But I want to have it on the record now.
Yeah.
With the hope that somebody will take it for action. And then if something bad does happen, at least they can say, well, we did the corrective action. It seemed to be working, and then we undid it, and now it's happened again. Let's put it back in place. But I'd rather not have people die to force
Yes.
that decision, right?
Yeah.
So also one of the things that we do in our background, but also in the military, is we think about, okay, the immediate ramifications of this may be a loss of readiness for a ship. But then when we sort of think beyond that, thankfully we've had a relatively peaceful naval history for the last couple of decades, right? Like there's been plenty of stuff going on, ships sitting off the coast of somewhere and providing support. But we haven't had the big naval battles and things like that of the days of old. But there is a lot of talk about, potential conflict and increased importance of the naval readiness in, the South China Sea and the Pacific. So it's going to be increasingly important for the next 10 years that the Navy is staffed and ready to go for those kinds of things. And so this seems like it's only going to be more probable that you might have these types of accidents, which could take entire ships or even like a fleet offline, right? Am I overthinking that, or is that sort of...
No, I think you're dead on. I think the warning signs are out there, as you said, and if it does become, there's China 2027, there's still some talk about Taiwan and that we're already stretched thin, right? So absolutely, there's a degradation, I think, that's going to manifest itself as things get tougher.
Yeah, thank you for that.
See, now you made me think about all this stuff again. Now you're blowing me out.
Now you're going to not sleep tonight.
Right. Thanks a lot. But no, so that's kind of my story. I'm very proud of what we accomplished as a group, both in the Navy and afterwards. And there's a lot of good people out there still serving their country. And half of our military are government service types or contractors working for the same end. And the vast majority of them don't really care who the president is. They just want to do their job. Working for a boss who makes you feel every day like you're unworthy and a waste of time. And it's just at some point you say, okay, I'll go work for somebody else that appreciates me. In an organization where all we learned, this was you take care of your people, right? Just in odd times. Okay, what else?
So you had mentioned you have your Substack. You have posted quite a few articles. We will make sure that we put that link on the website when we post the podcast. One question is, would you go back?
Would I go back? Me personally, right now, no, but more from a standpoint of any stress in my life now is all self-imposed, and I'm just a lot better off. So no, I would not go back. And I don't think I could go back. I think I burned those bridges when I wrote about it and when I shared my reasons for leaving. Now where you have to sign what's my favorite executive order, I would have to lie, to
12333.
I know that's what I was thinking, Philip. 12333. That's my favorite one.
What is that?
I'm sorry. I have one, but it's a very old one. It created the intelligence community, basically, and gave us all of our authorities. It was actually one that came out of some prior government failures from people who thought too much of themselves as well.
Yeah. So no, I'm not looking back. I'm happy to snipe from the sidelines a little bit, and I'll continue to write articles. I have a couple of books out there.
And aren't you writing another?
I am.
Aren't you writing another book?
So my friend Keith has been very adamant that if you don't write it down, no one will read it. I have on my wall back here, you can see it, but there's a letter from my grandfather when I joined the Navy in 1980. It said, basically, it said, you have a great record. We're very proud of you. Don't screw it up. And I've used that. I've had that hanging in my office in every job I had, now in my home office. And so I thought to myself, what if I wrote a letter to myself at each juncture in my career? In the Navy, it's easy because, each pay grade, 01 through 06, and then each job that I had. So I basically wrote myself a letter of, hey, here's what's going to happen in this next tour. And so I found some old pictures, put it together, found a publisher. And so I think the working title is Letters to Myself, if that's not taken somewhere. I've gotten some really good feedback, but that's coming out hopefully before Christmas. And I have another one called Going Circadian that kind of captures the story of change in the sleep domain. And then I have, I didn't mention it, but I took a dog on deployment on one of my ships. Wasn't authorized to. He just kind of showed up and we took him underway. He never pulled in during OIF. I have a children's book
Sounds
about
familiar,
that.
huh, Philip?
Yeah.
Yeah, we adopted a few dogs along the way.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we adopted this guy in Spain, and he ended up coming home and lived in Virginia Beach until he died a couple of years ago at 17. But so I have a children's book about that I'm pretty proud of. And they just did an audio book of it as well. No, so I'm going to keep writing and, kind of keep figuring out where I can contribute back to the folks that are still in the fight. I did a lot of suicide prevention training. There was a class called Safe Talk. One of my friends, Paul Bertrand, was the FBI suicide prevention office lead for a while. So he did that for 10 years after his naval service. So working with him on providing that class. So yeah, keeping busy. But, generally I'm kind of at one appointment per day for about an hour. And after that, I'm free to go shopping or go to the beach or do whatever my wife tells me we're doing today.
I'm sure
So,
she
yeah, life
loves
is
that.
good. Yeah. Although she has said, as she said, I married you for better for worse, but not for lunch every day.
That's great.
Such is life, right? But
Yeah.
yeah. Well, hey, it's been a pleasure talking to you all.
Yeah,
And
thank you
it's
so
nice to find
much.
kindred spirits out there. But no, I appreciate your time doing this. I appreciate the fact that you're doing it because you're giving a voice to people who might not be heard otherwise. And so I think it's important to have this stuff on the record.
Yeah, that's been our thing, is just give that platform for people to speak, to give a voice and a place to be heard. That's important, just to
Yep.
have that out there. But thank you so much, John, for joining us. We really appreciate it. And thank you for forking off with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Forking Off. To our listeners still in government, remember, your integrity is worth more than your TSP. Leaving doesn't mean giving up on public service. It just means finding new ways to serve.
Until next time,
Keep your ethics,
keep your dignity.
and we'll keep telling these stories.
If you're a former Fed with a story to tell, or you're wrestling with your own ethical crossroads, reach out to us at info@forkingoff.com.
Today's episode was created, produced, and edited by Jill and Philip Fields. Special thanks to Dr. John Cordle. You can find more information about this episode at forkingoff.com. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, Mastodon, LinkedIn, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Join us Monday, October 20th.
As we talk with Dr. Anna Mitchell of Anna Fired Fed.
I'm Anna Mitchell. I've now reinvented myself as Anna Fired Fed. I was able to turn my despair into action. To speak it into existence, I truly am trying to, or I'm going to, start a social movement, a cultural revolution, if you will, to make civic engagement part of people's everyday life.